The stars did not twinkle out here. They pulsed like slow heartbeats in the vast dark, each one a whisper from a place so distant it might as well be forgotten. Logan Ward leaned back in the pilot seat of his old freighter, the Rust Storm, eyes half-lidded, chewing on a stick of dry cinnamon gum that lost its flavor days ago. His fingers tapped absently on the worn dashboard, coated with scratches and faded stickers from 100 ports that no longer existed. Outside the windshield, the Orion cargo route stretched into infinity, a dead straight corridor of regulated emptiness, framed by blinking satellite buoys and speckled with the cold shimmer of ancient dust. No ships, no chatter, no trouble, just the hum of his ship's aging engine and the occasional static from a comms unit, tuned mostly to silence. This was how Logan liked it. No company, no contracts that talked back, just him, the stars, and whatever rust bucket cargo he was hauling from one forgotten moon to another. But just as his lids began to sink into that halfway sleep trucker trance, the scanner cracked to life with a high-pitched beep. Then another and another, a distress signal. Logan blinked, sat up straight. The screen flared faint green, showing a single blip drifting half a kilometer ahead. Faint signature. No ID, just a low-band SOS repeating itself, flickering in and out like a dying breath. He stared at it, unmoving. Out here, rules were different. You didn't stop for every cry for help. Pirates liked to play wounded. Slavers sent out ghost signals with traps waiting inside. Even the syndicates would fake crashes to lure in do-gooders for a fast hijack. Logan had seen it all, had walked away from friends who weren't so lucky. And yet, he rubbed a hand down his jaw, sighing through his teeth. Sometimes someone really was out there, alone, broken, dying. He flicked a switch. The ship groaned as it adjusted course. "Let's see who's knocking," he muttered. The target came into view 5 minutes later. A shuttle, barely larger than a lifeboat, drifting sideways like a paper scrap in a current. Its outer hull was scarred deep with burn marks and collision dents. One engine was completely dead. The other blinked in and out with a desperate sputter of power, like a failing heartbeat. No insignia, no beacons, no name. He toggled the comms. "This is Freighter Rust Storm. You in need of assistance," he said. No reply, just static. He frowned. Common sense screamed, "Leave it." But his gut tugged in the opposite direction. Something about the silence. It was too honest, too raw. Grabbing his coat and tool belt, Logan locked the freighter into hover and cycled open the airlock. The hallway hissed with pressurized air as he moved into the shuttle. Light flickering overhead like a heartbeat in distress. The hatch resisted. He forced it with a pry bar. Inside, the air was cold and thin. Lights flickered dimly across a cockpit, filled with broken panels and dripping coolant. No movement, no life. But then, at the far end of the compartment, curled against the wall like a ghostly statue, was a figure, small, unmoving. Logan's breath caught. She was humanoid, barely 5 feet tall, her skin a soft metallic silver blue that shimmered faintly even in the dying light. Long hair, too pale to be white, lay tangled around her shoulders like strands of starlight. Her clothes were torn and simple. A tunic, no boots, bare arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She was shivering. Logan crouched slowly, his palms raised. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay?" No answer, just 2 enormous violet eyes watching him in frozen silence, eyes full of something deeper than fear, loss. He stayed low, voice soft. "My name's Logan. I'm not here to hurt you, I just want to help. Are you alone?" A slow nod. That was enough. He peeled off his coat and moved forward, wrapping it around her shoulders. She didn't pull away, just trembled. "You're safe now," he said. But even as he said it, something in the air shifted, like the galaxy had just changed course, like this wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of something else entirely. The rust storm drifted like a tired whale through the void, engines purring with a low, faithful hum. Inside its cramped cockpit, the lights were dim, casting soft amber glows across metal panels and old hand-drawn stickers, dragons, comets, forgotten slogans. Logan sat in the pilot's seat, boots propped up, eyes drifting between the stars outside, and the girl now bundled beside him. She sat hunched in the co-pilot's chair, wrapped in his old coat and a thermal blanket that still smelled faintly of machine grease and cinnamon. Her violet eyes scanned every surface, cautious but no longer afraid. At least, not the same kind of fear as before. This was survival mode wariness, the kind that lingers after someone's run too long. Logan said nothing for a while. He didn't want to spook her. Instead, he moved slowly, pouring hot nutrient broth into a dented tin mug. Steam curled upward, soft and warm. He offered it across the console without a word. She hesitated. Then, with fingers so delicate they looked like glass, she took it, one slow sip, then another. Her shoulders loosened, just a little. Logan leaned back with a soft smile. Better than starving, right? No answer, but she gave a tiny nod. Progress. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with possibility, like standing on the edge of a new planet, waiting to see if the air would be breathable. Logan tapped his chest. "Logan," he said clearly. "Logan Ward." He pointed to her, raising his eyebrows. She blinked, lowered her eyes, then shook her head, slowly, firmly. "No name?" he asked gently. She didn't move, or don't want to share it. That's fine too. He reached for the old drawer by his feet and pulled out a battered sketch pad and a stubby pencil, the wood worn from years of zero-gravity doodles during long hauls. He flipped to a blank page, tore it off, and placed it on the console, then slid the pencil beside it. She looked at him, puzzled. He pointed. "Draw," he said simply. "Whatever you want." For a second, nothing. Then her silver-blue fingers reached forward. She picked up the pencil with a grip that was awkward, unsure, but after a deep breath, she began to draw. Line by line, slow and careful. Logan watched in silence as the page filled. A star, delicately arched, a flower with petals like teardrops, a dome-shaped house, and finally 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing side by side beneath a swirling sky. She didn't look at him, but her hands didn't tremble anymore. Logan swallowed hard. "That's beautiful," he said softly. She glanced at him. Just a flicker. Then, a smile. Small. Quiet. But real. And it hit him harder than any blaster ever could. He tapped his chest again. "Logan." Then he tapped the taller figure she'd drawn. Her eyes followed. She nodded once. He gestured to the smaller figure. She hesitated, then pointed to it, lifted the pencil again. Above its head, she drew a swirl of tiny stars. No words, just that. Logan leaned closer. "Is that your name?" She didn't answer, but after a moment she tilted her head, then nodded. Just once. He grinned. "Era," he said, giving the swirl a name. "Nice to meet you, Era." This time, her smile grew just enough to touch her eyes. And in that moment, floating through the cold silence of space, Logan Ward realized something simple and terrifying and beautiful. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone to protect. And her name was written in starlight. Haven Station looked like a lantern in the dark, a massive web of metal and lights suspended in the vacuum of space, humming with quiet life in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't clean, but it was neutral territory, a safe place, or so Logan Ward believed. The rust storm coasted in slow, her hull creaking under the strain of deceleration. Logan kept one hand on the manual thrusters, eyes flicking between screens. Beside him, Era sat quietly, bundled in layers that still didn't quite fit her. She stared through the window, her violet eyes wide, reflecting the station's glow like twin moons. "You'll be okay here," Logan said casually, not looking at her. "Haven's got food, med tech, even safe housing if you need it. No one's gonna ask questions they don't want the answers to." She didn't reply, but her hand reached out, ever so slightly, to rest on the edge of the console, close to his, not touching, but near. Logan noticed. He didn't say anything, just smiled as the docking clamps locked onto the rust storm. Something cold and wrong twisted in his gut, an instinct he'd long learned to trust. He glanced at the station's entry bay and froze. 6 security officers stood waiting by the airlock, too many for a routine scan. Their armor was sleek, matte black, faces hidden behind mirrored visors, and worse, they held stun rifles, all set to capture mode. Logan's voice went flat. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Era nodded and clutched the blanket tighter. The hatch hissed open with a mechanical groan. Metal met metal as Logan stepped onto the platform. His boots echoed too loud in the tense silence. The lead officer stepped forward, voice sharp. "You the captain of the freighter?" Logan nodded slowly. "Logan Ward, hauling cargo from Elian Drift." The officer didn't look impressed. He tilted his helmet slightly. "We received a report about a stolen asset. Description matches your passenger." Logan didn't blink. "She's not cargo." "Not according to the claim filed by the HFY Syndicate." That name, it hit like a blaster to the chest. Logan's jaw tightened. He stepped slightly to the side, placing himself directly between Era and the guards. "She's not theirs. She's not anyone's." The officer's voice dropped. "Move aside, trucker. Don't make this difficult." But Logan was already shaking his head. "She's under my protection." The lead officer laughed, a dry mechanical bark behind the helmet. He lifted his weapon. Logan moved first. In one swift motion, he pulled a wrench from his belt and hurled it across the bay. It hit one of the guards square in the visor, sending him sprawling. "Run!" he shouted. Era didn't hesitate. She bolted, bare feet whispering over metal, vanishing into a maintenance corridor. Logan ducked behind a crate, blaster shots singing past his head. He dove after her, heart hammering, lungs burning, adrenaline flooding every muscle. They tore through the bowels of the station, maintenance shafts, back corridors, forgotten storage halls. Logan didn't look back. He didn't need to. The sound of armored boots and echoing orders told him all he needed to know. They were being hunted. But something strange happened in those frantic moments. Amid the flickering lights and alarms, he saw Era glance back at him, not in panic, but with clarity. Her face was streaked with grime and fear, but her expression had changed. She wasn't just running. She was choosing. And Logan understood then. This wasn't just a girl with a secret. She was a storm waiting to rise. And whatever the HFY Syndicate wanted, they had made one mistake. They had sent their fire after someone who had already found her light. And Logan Ward wasn't going to let them extinguish it. The old cargo bay was cold, dark, smelled of rust and burned oil. Logan slammed the heavy door behind them, jamming a bent metal pipe through the handles. It wouldn't hold long, but it might buy them minutes, maybe seconds. His chest heaved, his shoulder burned from a near-miss graze. The air inside the chamber was still, heavy, almost too quiet. Across from him, Era stood perfectly still. The blanket she had worn was gone, dropped somewhere during the chase. Her silver-blue skin shimmered faintly in the shadows, her eyes bright and unblinking. Not with fear, with focus. Logan stepped forward slowly, lowering his blaster. "You okay?" She nodded once, but then she did something he didn't expect. She reached into the folds of her torn tunic, layers of worn fabric that had once been a robe, now nothing more than threadbare rags, and pulled something out. At first, Logan thought it was just a stone, small, black, smooth. But as Era held it up, the air seemed to change. Thicker, charged, symbols etched across its surface began to glow, not with light, but with presence. Soft white lines pulsed gently across its skin, like veins filled with starlight. And the moment it left her hand and hovered between them, Logan felt it. In his chest, like a vibration beneath his bones. "What is that?" he asked, voice low. Era didn't speak. She just held it out toward him, cupped in both palms, as if she were offering him a piece of her soul. He stared at it. Something in the back of his mind whispered warnings. Ancient tech, forbidden relics, Corsair-level contraband. But the whisper was drowned out by something else. A feeling, a knowing. He reached toward it slowly, but didn't touch. "That's why they're chasing you, isn't it?" he murmured. "It's not just you. It's this." Era nodded, expression somber. Logan looked closer. The light in the stone flickered in rhythm with her heartbeat. It wasn't just a tool. It was bonded to her. Or maybe she was bonded to it. "Is it dangerous?" he asked. Era tilted her head. Then, without speaking, she crouched down and placed the stone gently on the floor between them. She pressed one hand to the floor, one to the stone, closed her eyes. The ground beneath them hummed. And then, slowly, glowing shapes bloomed outward, patterns of energy unfolding in a circle, like a star map, constellations, pathways, doors. Logan felt the pull of it in his gut. A key, a gate, something ancient, alive. He stepped back, rubbing his jaw. "Well, that answers that." Era opened her eyes, the glow in them still lingering. She looked up at him, and for the first time Logan saw more than a refugee. He saw a guardian. And now that made him something too. A target, a partner, maybe even something bigger. "You're not just running from the Corsair," he said. "You're running because of what you carry. And they'll tear the galaxy in half to get it back." Era stood. Her small hands closed around the stone again, and the map vanished. She met his gaze. No fear, only resolve. The door behind them thudded hard. Then again. The pipe rattled. Logan's hand went to his blaster. He took a breath. "All right, Era, no more running." He looked around the old storage bay. Rusted ladders, forgotten containers, a half-broken drone in the corner. Not much, but enough. He grinned, sharp and tired. "Let's make it a little harder for them." Era's fingers tightened around the stone. Her eyes narrowed. She was done hiding. So was he. Because whatever this thing was, this artifact, this key, this message from the stars, it had chosen her. And she had chosen him. Together, they would fight. And the Corsair syndicate would learn too late what it meant to chase someone who no longer feared the dark. They waited in silence, hidden behind a stack of cracked cargo crates. Logan crouched low, blaster resting against his knee. The light was dim in the storage bay, filtered through dust-coated ceiling grates that buzzed faintly with old power. Somewhere beyond the walls, boots pounded in rhythm. Muffled voices barked orders. The Corsair were sweeping the station with ruthless efficiency. Era sat close beside him, her knees pulled to her chest. The black stone cradled tightly against her heart. Her violet eyes flicked toward the sound of each noise, each footstep. But her expression didn't waver. Not anymore. Logan glanced sideways at her, brow furrowed. "They won't stop," he said under his breath. "They'll tear this station apart just to get to you." Era's head lowered for a second, guilt dancing across her face like a passing shadow. He nudged her gently. "Hey, this isn't your fault." She looked at him, no words. But her eyes said more than a sentence ever could. She hadn't asked for any of this. Hadn't wanted to drag anyone into it. And yet, she had trusted him. Not just with her safety, but with whatever that stone was. That trust pressed heavier on Logan than any weapon. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Logan used the time to think, to plan. He mapped the station in his mind, remembering the maintenance shafts he used years ago when he hauled junk here, the old service tunnels where no cameras worked, the forgotten exits. Beside him, Era had taken a piece of scrap metal from the floor and was drawing quietly with the end of a snapped wire. Logan leaned over to see. She had etched a simple scene, a ship flying through the stars, a figure holding a glowing object, and beside them, another figure standing tall with a wide jacket and broad shoulders. Logan smiled softly. "That's us." Era's lips curled upward just slightly. She nodded once, then pointed at the stone in her drawing. "You're carrying something big, aren't you?" Logan whispered. "Not just powerful, something that means something." She tilted her head, then, with great care, added a few more lines. A ring of figures surrounding the one with the stone. Some bowed, others knelt. One raised a hand as if to shield it. He got the message. Whatever the stone was, it wasn't just valuable, it was sacred. And she was its bearer. Logan stood slowly, stretching his legs. "All right, I might know a way out." He crossed the room and pulled at a rusted panel in the wall. Behind it, a narrow tunnel stretched into darkness. An old maintenance route most dock workers had long forgotten. "It's tight," he muttered, peering into the passage. "But it might just get us past the Corsai nets." He turned back. "You trust me?" No hesitation. Era stood, placed the stone into a small pouch tied at her side, and nodded firmly. Logan's chest tightened. He didn't know why it hit him so hard. Maybe because of how quickly she answered. Or maybe because, out of every being in the galaxy, she had chosen him. A stubborn, worn-out freighter pilot, with no medals, no titles. But maybe, for her, that was enough. They crawled into the tunnel, single file. It was barely wide enough for Logan's shoulders. The air smelled like dust and rusted coolant, and the floor vibrated faintly from the station's reactors. Logan led the way, one hand brushing along the wall for balance, the other ready on his blaster. Era followed close, her small feet making almost no sound. At one point, a group of Corsai patrolled overhead. Logan froze, pulling Era close and shielding her with his body. They held their breath as voices passed, loud, angry, hunting. When the danger slipped away, Era exhaled softly. Her hand gripped Logan's coat, just for a moment. He glanced down. She was steady now, fierce. The fear was still there, but behind it was something stronger, resolve. They kept moving. Eventually, they emerged into a half-abandoned service bay at the edge of the station. Rows of forgotten ships sat in long-term storage. Most were gutted, stripped for parts, but one, an old cargo shuttle with a battered hull and faded paint, still showed signs of power. Logan pointed. "That's our ticket out." They started forward, but movement caught his eye. A shadow shifted near the crates, and then a figure stepped into view. Corsai, but not a foot soldier, a bounty hunter. He was tall, armored in reinforced plating that gleamed with syndicate sigils, twin blasters holstered on his sides, a shock baton resting across his shoulders, and eyes like burned coal behind a tinted visor. "End of the road," the hunter growled. "Hand over the girl, trucker. You can still walk away." Logan stepped in front of Era, hand lowering to his blaster. "Not a chance," he said flatly. The hunter chuckled. "You think you can protect her? Against us?" Logan looked back at Era. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't hiding. She stood tall, shoulders square, the pouch at her side glowing faintly. And then Logan understood something deep and unshakable. He wasn't protecting her anymore. They were protecting each other. He drew his blaster. Era stepped beside him, lifting the stone. Its glow intensified, soft at first, then pulsing bright like a rising sun. The hunter hesitated. Too late. Without a word, Logan and Era moved as one. Not fleeing, not hiding, fighting. And for the first time, Logan didn't feel like a trucker. He felt like something more, like destiny had just tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Run with her, or die trying." And he chose to run, right into the fire. The hatch slammed shut behind them, just as a plasma bolt exploded against the metal. Sparks danced across the narrow passage, like angry fireflies. Logan didn't stop to look back. He shoved Era forward into the darkness, heart thudding in sync with every footfall. "This way," he barked, voice hoarse. They plunged into Iron Alley. Not a real alley, not on any official map, just a nickname whispered by dockhands and smugglers, an old tangle of forgotten service corridors and crumbling access shafts buried deep inside Haven Station. It was a place even the Corsai avoided. No surveillance, no official patrols, no rules. But Logan knew it well. He had slept in its corners, hauled stolen plasma cores through its vents, and once even outrun a bounty collector with a grudge and a shock whip. This place was chaos carved into metal, and tonight it was their only chance. Era kept pace without a sound, her small feet barely making contact with the ground. Logan marveled at how quickly she moved, fluid and light, like she belonged in the shadows. The glow from the pouch at her side lit her face in pulses, a beacon that both guided and threatened to expose them. Behind them, Corsai boots thundered on steel. Voices shouted orders, distorted by static helmets. "They're gaining," Logan hissed, eyes darting through the maze. Every turn looked the same. Every hatch, a potential dead end. He led her down a left corridor, then up a slanted ramp, slick with condensation. Pipes leaked steam overhead, walls groaned with age. The air tasted of oil and ozone. They rounded a corner and stopped dead. A collapsed tunnel. Steel beams bent inward like crushed ribs. No way forward. Before Logan could curse, a blaster bolt sizzled past, burning a hole through a nearby wall. "Up!" he shouted, spotting an old maintenance ladder. Without question, Era leapt. Her hands found the rungs, her feet following like she'd done this 1,000 times. Logan climbed after her, the ladder groaning under his weight. Blaster fire filled the shaft. Sparks rained from above. They reached the top, where a rusted grate blocked their path. Logan slammed his shoulder into it once, twice. The metal shrieked. Era gave him a look, worried, tense. He grinned. "I've got it." One final heave, and the grate broke free. They rolled out onto a wide catwalk, high above the lower docks. The space stretched out below them like a steel canyon. Rows of ships, flickering lights, long shadows. The air was thick with the smell of plasma coolant and burnt wiring. Far below, Haven Station still pulsed with life. Markets buzzed. Cargo droids wheeled along rails. The chaos of a living outpost continued. Unaware that a war was unfolding above their heads, they sprinted across the catwalk. Behind them, Corsai emerged from the grate, shouting. A shot clipped Logan's shoulder. He stumbled. Era caught his arm, steadied him. "You okay?" her eyes asked. He nodded through clenched teeth. "Keep moving." They reached the end of the catwalk and stopped again. A gap. The bridge ahead had collapsed. Below, a maintenance platform. Narrow. Possibly too far. Logan looked at Era. "You trust me?" Without hesitation, she nodded. He scooped her into his arms, took 3 running steps, and jumped. For one breathless moment, they were weightless. Wind roared in his ears. Then, impact. They crashed hard onto the platform, rolled across the metal floor, and slammed into a storage crate. Pain lit Logan's ribs like fire. Era's hands still clutched his jacket. He grunted, sitting up. "Next time," he gasped, "we take the stairs." Era laughed. A real laugh. Soft, musical, and alive. But the sound was short-lived. More footsteps, more hunters. Logan pulled her to her feet. Ahead, a shuttle. Small, rusted, but powered. A forgotten bird in a cage of metal. He ran for it, slapped the access panel. The ramp hissed, too slow. Blaster fire sparked against the hull. "Go, Era!" he shouted. She didn't hesitate. She ran up the ramp, spun into the cockpit. Logan fired 2 quick shots to cover her, then dashed after. The moment his boots hit the ramp, he slammed the close button. The door sealed with a heavy clunk just as plasma fire lit the outside. Alarms blared. Logan collapsed into the pilot's seat. Era was already strapping in beside him, hands flying across controls. The engine screamed. The ship lifted, shaking like it might fall apart mid-air. Then, freedom. They tore away from the dock, into open space. Stars unfolded before them like a curtain drawn wide. Inside, breathless and bruised, Logan leaned back in his seat. He glanced at Era. She was smiling. Not a half smile. Not the tight, cautious ones she'd given before. This was full. Free. Alive. Logan smiled too. They had escaped Iron Alley. They had survived the Corsae. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it. Together. The stars spilled across the cockpit window like rivers of silver dust, endless and quiet. The stolen shuttle hummed around them, its old systems surprisingly stable, despite years of neglect. Logan sat slumped in the pilot's seat, the adrenaline crash finally hitting him. His shoulder throbbed, his ribs all ached. But the worst pain wasn't physical, it was the weight of what now? He turned his head slowly toward Ira, who sat in the co-pilot's chair, her legs tucked up beneath her, the pouch containing the black stone, resting quietly against her side. Her face glowed with the fading shimmer of adrenaline, and something more, peace. She had curled slightly into the seat, like a child settling into a place that finally felt safe. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she stirred. Without a word, Era reached into the pouch again. But this time, she didn't pull out the black stone. Instead, she drew out a second object, smaller, clear as glass, but inside it swirled a storm of stars, tiny galaxies, spiraling light, a universe contained within crystal. She cradled it in both palms like something sacred, then turned toward Logan, offering it forward. He blinked. "Hey," he said, raising both hands gently. "I told you, I didn't help you to get anything back." Era didn't respond. She simply placed the crystal in his hand, closed his fingers around it, and looked up into his eyes. That look, it wasn't gratitude like humans understood it. It wasn't payment. It was something older, something deeper, a kind of emotional language that needed no translation. When Logan's fingers closed around the crystal, warmth bloomed from it, soft, steady, not heat, memory. Images flickered behind his eyes, fields of silver grass bending in alien winds, towering spires made of crystal, humming with song, a sky filled with constellations that pulsed in time with a heartbeat not his own. And standing at the center of it all, Era, younger, surrounded by figures robed in starlight, each one bowing as she held the black stone. Then everything faded. He opened his eyes. His throat was tight. You're more than a courier, aren't you?" he whispered. Era nodded once, slowly. She pressed her forehead gently against his chest, a gesture he didn't understand. But his heart answered it anyway, slowing, grounding. "Protector," she whispered. The first word he'd ever heard her say, aloud. And she said it in his language. The crystal in his hand pulsed, reacting to the sound. Outside, the stars remained unchanged, but inside, something vast had shifted. Era stepped back and looked up at him, her expression soft, but resolute. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with trust. Logan swallowed the lump in his throat. "You didn't have to give me this," he said, "but thank you." She reached out, placed a small hand over his, over the crystal, a bond. Not just forged in fire, or escape, or war, but in choice. She could have left it buried, she could have kept running. But she had chosen to stop, to speak, to share this one, private thing. And Logan knew exactly what it meant. She hadn't just survived, she had passed something on. He sat quietly for a while, as she curled back into the seat and drifted into sleep. The blanket wrapped around her small frame. The crystal rested on his chest, humming like a second heartbeat. And in that hum, he heard a truth he hadn't dared believe in years. He wasn't alone anymore. The shuttle coasted into the outer edge of the free zones, its path traced by distant beacons and trader lanes lit like spiderwebs of stars. Ahead, an outpost appeared, half market, half haven. Ships of all kinds docked in its ports. No Corsai banners flew here, no bounty hunters watched from the shadows. This place was untamed, but it was free. Logan adjusted the controls with a steady hand. For the first time in days, no alarm blared, no one fired, no one chased. Era sat beside him, awake now, her violet eyes fixed on the view beyond the cockpit glass. A flicker of excitement danced in her gaze as the outpost grew closer. Neon banners waved over narrow bridges. Market stalls bustled with strange colors. Laughter echoed over open comms. There was life here, real life. Logan chuckled softly. "You'll like it here," he said, his voice warm. "Freedom's messy, but it's yours." The shuttle touched down with a soft thud. The platform extended, lights cycled to green. He stood first, then offered her a hand. She didn't hesitate. Together they walked down the ramp into the crowd. Vendors called out in a dozen languages. Children darted between legs. Musicians played something upbeat and weird. Era's fingers clutched his as they moved through it all. When they reached the edge of the square, Logan stopped. He knelt to her level, looked her in the eyes. "This is it," he said. "You're safe now. You can start over. Make your own choices." Era didn't answer at first. Her lips pressed tight, like holding back something too big for words. Then slowly, she reached into her pouch and pulled out the crystal, the one with galaxies inside. She pressed it to his chest, right over his heart. "Protector," she said again, softly. The word carried. Passers-by turned. Some paused. A few gasped. Logan looked around in confusion. Then realization struck him. This wasn't just a thank you. It was a marking. An ancient rite. In her culture, to call someone protector in public, to present the crystal, was to name them not just a friend, but a soul-bonded guardian. A vow, a legend. Some whispered, others bowed, and Logan understood what she had done. She had told the galaxy who he was now. Not a drifter, not a trucker, not a nobody. Protector. He started to speak, to argue, to say he was just a man with a ship and a tired heart. But the words never came, because deep down, he knew it was true. Era smiled, bright, brave, whole. Then, with one last look, she turned and stepped into the market crowd. Free, strong, home. Logan watched her go until she vanished behind a line of silk banners. He stood there for a long moment, the crystal still pressed to his chest. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the shuttle. The rust storm rumbled to life beneath his hands. He launched it into the dark once more. Another long road, another cargo run, another lonely path between stars. But now he smiled, because he wasn't really alone. Somewhere out there, in the shifting light of unknown systems, a small alien girl remembered his name. And on worlds he would never visit, songs would whisper about the human who asked for nothing and gained everything. What do you think Era's crystal truly was? Do you believe in the power of quiet choices and unlikely friendships? Drop a comment below and tell us your favorite moment from Logan's journey.